So now I move to the part 4, the historical roots again, but focus on the first is the state, the sovereignty issue, independence issue. And now I move to the peasantry, the historic, also very important historical condition. The first, I think that the Chinese Revolution was carried out in the context of a traditional agrarian society. The peasantry was the main subject and agent of the revolution. Peasants paid huge sacrifice and a huge contribution both to the Chinese Revolution, land reform, and the reform. Chinese reform started from 1978 to 1979. Basically, before the 1989, Chinese reform can be divided into the 2 stages. Usually, we describe the first stage as what kind of the reform? Agriculture reform, rural reform. The basically redistribution of land, family household system. Basically the collapse of the People's Commune, redistribution of the land to the family. Is a collective ownership based on the collective ownership. So how that possible, the collective ownership or the redistribution of land equally? I think that was the most equal reform, redistributed the land. You know, after 1985, that was the second stage of Chinese reform. That was the starting point of the urban reform. Only 4 years later, the crisis happened, 1989. So a lot of the contradictions, conflicts accumulated in the whole process of the urban reform. Enterprises reform, urban reform. However, most of the observers believe that the success, that was big success, was the rural reform of China. Basically, the legitimation of Chinese reform based on the rural reform. So without the rural reform, it's very difficult to understand why in the 1980s the whole nation became so enthusiastic for the whole reform and opening policy. So that was the period of that. However, when we talk about this, because obviously a lot of people blame People's Commune, the Great Leap Forward, and so on and so forth. A lot of the sacrifice happened during that time. However, if the land, after the collapse of People's Commune, the land could be equally redistributed, that precondition of that was a long process of the land revolution. Without that land revolution in the whole 20th century, sometimes quite violent, it's very difficult to imagine that kind of the land reform could happen in this way. So this is the one point. Second point is also very interesting, dated back to the 20th century, because we used to say China is a so-called a socialist state. And then we say that the socialist revolution, right, in the 1950s, 60s. However, many historians find it's very difficult to understand how to define the term socialism in Chinese context. Because basically the socialism, the modern socialism, was a European phenomenon, was a result of the industrialization, was a result of the social differentiation between the bourgeois and the so-called working class. When the Chinese Revolution happened, many historians found that In China, there were almost no the working class as a class. Of course, a lot of the workers, but it's very difficult to define those workers as a class. Compared to the most of population, of agrarian population, that was very minimal. It's a very small part of the population. And also, there was a very few so-called bourgeois or the capitalists in the sense of Western context in the early 20th century. So both bourgeois and the working class are less developed. But politically speaking, there was socialist revolution happened. So because of this, we need to imagine how could these kind of revolution happened in a rural society without the great transformation of political consciousness of the rural population, the peasants, to shape the new political subjectivity. It's very difficult to understand what Chinese revolution was. So it's very difficult to understand these. In Russia, for example, give you the example, in Russia. Of course, Russia is still a huge rural population, agrarian population. But the October Revolution, who were the soldiers? The workers, the soldiers, mainly urban population, not the rural population. But in Chinese case, were very different. If you look at the wars, both anti-Japanese, the resistance war or the civil war, most of the soldiers were peasants. When I visit countries, especially like in South Asia, if we visit Nepal, India, many other South Asian countries, in those countries, because there was no long process of land reform, it was still the situation in the country and the whole phenomena of the peasants for the political, the will for them were very different. It's quite different. So in that sense, the success of the Chinese reform started from first stage rural reform. And those people, the peasants, played the extremely important role. Up to now, you see the so-called new working class. Who are the new working class in China now? But we know that China became the biggest world factory, right? Who are the workers? Peasants, yes. Agrarian migrants, agrarian laborers, were all from the countrysides. There were arguments among the economists or the politicians for the explanation of Chinese economic growth. One typical explanation is the cheap labor. They thought that China has so many cheap laborers, so that's why explain how Chinese economy can keep growing in last decades. But I remember that many years ago, I visited Indonesia. That day was the day before the Indonesian president visited China. He held a press conference. He made the comments. He said that, everybody said that because of the cheap labors in China, Chinese economy performed so well. However, our labor is cheaper than in China. Why? Our economy didn't perform so well compared to China. So in that sense, on the one hand, cheap labors, yes. But on the other hand, the quality of labors, literacy, education, the capacity of organization were very important. Without these, it's difficult to imagine so many entrepreneurs and so many people, so capable guys in the market economy, in the social affairs, they can perform this well. They're peasants. So without the long 20th century, long revolution, and the short 20th century, it's difficult to understand this because of the establishment of the education, especially after the 1950s. The literacy, the level of literacy became high and high. And so these were a lot of the issues, a lot of the difficulties, but basically these were the role of the peasants were very important. When we think about the Chinese reform, we are not, I emphasize this because most of people will talk about the role of leadership. Deng Xiaoping, obviously, he's a great politician with a great perspective. But on the other hand, we need to have the broad perspective to understand the historical condition. So, these enduring and intense rural transformation had three consequences. First, in the course of the land reform and the transformation of the rural order, the peasantry acquired a very strong political consciousness. In this respect, Eastern European and even Soviet peasants seldom saw that kind of extended armed struggle and the land reform. Without this background, it would have been impossible to mobilize peasants enduringly around the central aim of the transformation of land relations. These were long. Second, if we really want to understand the relationship between the peasant movement and the Chinese socialist movement, then we have to understand the role played by the Chinese Revolutionary Party, because most of the party members came from the peasants, the rural backgrounds too. Third, the new land relations established in the course of the revolution and the construction formed the premise for the reforms, whose starting point was the equal redistribution of land. So still, we know that the how to redistribution of land, whether or not Chinese land should be privatized, will still remain a big question for the debates. But the early stages, we need to understand this redistribution land and the rural transformation was so important for Chinese reform. Without this, it's very difficult to understand the Chinese reform. This is up to now, not only the first stage of rural reform, even up to now, because most of the workers came from the backgrounds of the agriculture and the rural societies. Now, obviously, we know that by the end of last century, there were so-called three known crises: agriculture crisis, rural crisis, and the crisis of peasants. The big issue. Basically, now the rural society more and more dependent on the urban economy. So these are a lot of the issues. So divide between the urban and the rural continue. And the social inequality happening here. And these days, the two sessions, one of the issues about the unequal redistribution was still about the suffering of the agrarian migrant workers. So this is a big crisis. But on the other hand, we need to remember the contribution of the peasants in the whole process of Chinese reform.